Hot on the heels of our Intel DG1 video card review and our AMD APU reviews, the 56 and 5700G options, we're now looking at AMD FSR, or FidelityFX Super Resolution. This has been often compared, at least in part, to DLSS. It's never really been meant to be a head-to-head competitor with DLSS, but that's been sort of the lazy or the easy comparison. And now we're going to look at FSR, explain more in detail what it is, how it relates to DLSS, and where it diverges in path. And we'll look at some benchmark performance as well for the various quality modes that are offered through AMD FSR. This one, if you haven't paid attention for the last month or so, has been in the news mostly because of AMD's absolute power move, where it announced it was fully supporting NVIDIA's products with FSR. Before that, this video is brought to you by Crucial and its Crucial X6 portable SSD. We use these external SSDs all over the office for rapidly transferring games and files between systems. The X6 comes in 500 gigabytes, 1 terabyte, 2 terabyte, and 4 terabyte capacities with USB-A or USB Type-C for the cable. For a high-speed and high-capacity external drive from Crucial, click the link in the description below. So the hardware support list for this one's pretty big. It supports more or less everything at this point. GTX 900 series works, the 10 series definitely works. AMD showed that in its keynote where the 1060 got uplift from FSR. And also AMD's older hardware works. And two, the Intel DG1 that we just reviewed, in theory, it should work with FSR. We haven't done a full test pass on it. But it's fairly open. The games list is short, unfortunately. There aren't a lot of games, we'll put it up on the screen, that support FSR right now. But AMD is working with developers to broaden support, and that's the key here. Because without support from developers, it'll go nowhere. Let's cover the basics first, if you missed it. AMD FidelityFX Super Resolution is the newest addition to AMD's FidelityFX graphics suite. AMD's got a couple of other things in there. It's a library of effects. FidelityFX is part of AMD's GPU Open and its open source software suite, which encompasses other libraries like TressFX, CAS, for example, or Contrast Adaptive Sharpening, and also supports ShadowFX and a couple of other SDKs. As the name implies, FidelityFX has a focus on post-processing effects that increase visual fidelity, like denoiser and contrast adaptive sharpening. And to summarize, GPU Open is the top-level name for all of AMD's open source software. FidelityFX is a group of effects, and FSR is one specific effect from that group. FSR is intended to take low-resolution source images or source frames and then upscale them to make them appear sharper and overall better in quality. And this is supposed to help balance the performance and the image quality, especially in a market where GPU choices have been limited for a long time. And that's why this got so much praise from the enthusiast community when it was announced, because instead of pushing out another GPU, AMD read the room a bit and put this out there instead to help with the older GPUs. At least that was sort of the marketing around it. So FSR is intended to do some of the things that DLSS does, but not at all in the same way. They approach the topic very differently. This is ultimately a game feature, not a driver feature, and that's key. So the games have to individually add FSR as a graphics option. And likewise, if AMD stops supporting FSR, as long as the games keep supporting it, it'll continue to work. AMD makes a lot of claims with this one, but it also has a lot of qualifiers associated with those claims. So it's a bizarre mix of hesitance and confidence with FSR. One of the claims is a quote-unquote 2.4x increase in performance. And AMD says this all throughout the reviewer guide. You go down to the footnote at the very bottom, and it specifies that, quote, provides on average 2.4x the performance when running at 4K in FSR performance mode across FSR supported games. And we'll talk about performance mode in a moment, but it's the lowest quality one. So just to set the stage before we get into benchmarks, don't expect this 2.4x number that was also at 4K that AMD is citing here in everything. It still works pretty well, but just keep the expectations in check for what FSR really does. Okay, enough of all that. The team pulled an all-nighter on this one to get it up after the APUs and the Intel DGPU review that we just did. So hopefully you find this interesting. We've got a section from Patrick first, talking about how FSR works and what it is, and then we'll go through some benchmarks and image quality comparisons. We should probably start with the easy misconceptions and the confusion within AMD's software stack. AMD's existing CAS effect includes an optional static or dynamic upscaling element, as seen in games like Cyberpunk 2077 actually. This may lead to some confusion as to the difference between FidelityFX CAS and FidelityFX FSR Super Resolution, which is justifiable. CAS has upscaling and sharpening, and FSR has upscaling and sharpening. From a marketing standpoint, the difference is that FSR has inherited the inference of being a one-to-one alternative to DLSS, while CAS was branded as a more unique to AMD feature. In fact, CAS was originally marketed after the mess of DLSS 1.0, when everything was blurry and looked terrible, and that is why it got the marketing it did. The functional difference, though, between CAS and FSR is that FSR attempts to cleanly upscale edges of objects to create the illusion of a higher render resolution, while CAS is focused solely on sharpening. CAS doesn't necessarily try to make a 1080p frame look like a 4K frame. It just does a sharpening pass. Based on discussion with AMD, FSR includes a sharpening pass and is a straight upgrade from CAS. AMD's official statement to Gamers Nexus was as follows, quote, FSR includes a sharpening component to extract pixel detail on the upscaled resolution image. It is therefore mutually exclusive with any existing sharpening option that games may already support. AMD recommends that all FSR quality assessments be done against a native image that does not have CAS or RIS enabled. As for our assumption, we'd assume that FSR will eventually supersede CAS. FSR is also not the same thing as Virtual Super Resolution, or VSR, that we covered in 2014. This was AMD's name for super sampling, or SSAA. VSR renders at a higher resolution than the display, allowing for a high-quality output image with reduced aliasing. VSR makes performance worse and image quality better. FSR makes performance better and image quality arguably worse, although AMD is trying to not have that happen. Getting into really how it works, then, there are 4 settings levels for FSR 1.0. Ultra quality, quality, balanced, and performance. This is the same naming convention that NVIDIA uses for DLSS 2.0, except with an important addition. That's ultra quality. The reason this is important is because it's ultra, and obviously that makes AMD better. End of argument. See you in the comments. We look forward to NVIDIA's DLSS 2.0 Ti setting in the future.
The GeForce RTX 3080 Ti.
Each setting has a specific scale factor in relation to the native screen size. For example, performance has a render resolution of 1/2 that of the screen size per dimension. Really important there. On a 3840 by 2160 screen, FSR performance upscales frames rendered at 1920 by 1080. Balanced uses a render resolution that's 10/17 per dimension, so that'd be X and Y. Quality uses 2/3, and ultra quality uses 10/13. Again, these are ratios per dimension. 1080p by name is half of 2160p, but in reality it's only a quarter of the pixel count. Ultra quality might sound close to native, but the pixel count is still only 59% of the native screen resolution. These ratios aren't tied to specific screen sizes or resolutions though, and that's good, because that means FSR should prove flexible in working with unusual resolutions or unusual aspect ratios. AMD has also stated that FSR can work with dynamic resolution scaling in games which support it. A major difference from NVIDIA's DLSS is that FSR has no temporal aspect. FSR gets applied to one single rendered frame at a time with no knowledge of past frames held in the buffer or knowledge of future frames predicted by motion vectors. These are both features of NVIDIA DLSS. This is a significant limitation in terms of the so-called smartness of AMD's. That is to say, NVIDIA's technology is doing more in a more advanced way. But it also makes FSR easier to implement and easier to scale. As with DLSS, everyone should temper their expectations with FSR. FSR is inherently lossy. That's the nature of it. Even at ultra quality, FSR is working with fewer pixels and less data than the native resolution, and its reconstruction won't be perfect. AMD almost made it through, actually, the entire reviewer guide without once claiming otherwise. But it did sneak in this line, quote, in some situations, FSR at ultra quality can produce visibly better than native image quality at normal gaming and viewing distances on titles that don't employ sharpening or use it sparingly. Okay, sure AMD. There's a lot of qualifiers in that sentence. But what AMD's trying to say with all of those qualifiers is don't get your hopes up. This isn't really actually going to happen, but you're going to trick yourself into thinking it did if you think that blasting sharpness looks better. FSR is still per game. in the sense that developers have to manually add the feature as a post-processing step after anti-aliasing is applied and before the UI and effects like film grain are added. But it doesn't require per-game image training like DLSS 1.0 did, or motion vectors provided by the game engine like DLSS 2.0 does. This is helpful, but more so for developers than for us. Whether or not FSR requires image training doesn't really make much difference to the end user. The aspect that does benefit the consumer is that FSR isn't strictly hardware dependent or driver dependent, so it should work equally well with the non-AMD GPUs and the cards that don't have ray tracing hardware, and it should continue to work even if AMD chooses to stop actively supporting it. Outside of our own testing, we've gotten word of FSR working on cards at least as old as the NVIDIA GTX 900 series, and it could go back further. It should also work on the Intel Iris Xe DG1 video card that we recently reviewed, showing how wide of a support spectrum FSR offers. Time for the comparison screenshots. We're going to put a couple of different FSR options on the screen alongside native right now, but for now, we're not going to label them. The options we're showing are native resolution, FSR balanced, and FSR performance. The point, though, is to allow you some time to try and identify the differences between them while we talk through this next section. We're trying to help you identify your own biases, so you can remove them, hopefully, when viewing the comparisons later. For all of our comparison screenshots, we maximized all the in-game settings, except for post-processing effects, which we minimized or disabled when possible. Anti-aliasing was also maxed out where available, and our intention for this was to provide FSR with the best possible input and apply as few post-FSR effects as possible. Capture was taken on our GPU test bench with a Sapphire RX 6800 XT Nitro, and all of that explained, time to show the labels for each of those settings. Comment below if you got it right, or how wrong you got it. Anno's up first. The brightly lit foliage of Anno 1800 presents a challenge for FSR with lots of noise in the form of 1-pixel shadows. This is the kind of detail that's in the most danger of being lost. If detail isn't visible at all in the low-res source image that FSR upscales, FSR obviously has no chance to reconstruct it. Even at ultra quality, this loss of detail is visible in the grassy field at the upper left of the screen, where the small stones and the blades of grass are unavoidably blurred. The horizontal fence railings behind the building at the center of the screen are only partially visible, even at 4K native, and are promptly erased when even the highest FSR quality level is applied. Still, ultra quality looks close enough to native 4K that the difference might not be immediately obvious without this side-by-side comparison, and that's the main goal. If the player can't notice the loss in gameplay, then the output is good. Dropping down further to quality, the trees become muddier with less distinction between leaves and branches, and so all of these things compared, ultra quality appears to be the ideal mix for Anno. FSR is a clear improvement over the source resolutions that it works with. Comparing Anno at 4K with FSR performance mode to Anno running at 1080p native demonstrates that FSR can successfully highlight details in areas like the stone and the wood textures of the docks. The second scene in Anno is more favorable. The brightly colored and clearly delineated houses and docks are better suited to upscaling with FSR than the fine details of the forest, and the roofs of the houses look almost the same at quality as they do at native 4K. Notable exceptions are the tile roofs on the two buildings at the top of the village and the striped red and white tent at the center of the screen. The closely placed parallel lines get blurred with lower source resolutions, and at the balanced setting, FSR actually reconstructs the stripes running in the wrong direction. These artifacts aren't present when running the game at 1080p, which is the source resolution used for FSR performance, and the artifacts that we're seeing are similar to some of the ones we've seen with DLSS in the past. And that's because the root cause of the issue is the same, which is limited source information. The Riftbreaker has some of the same loss of detail that Anno did in areas like palm fronds and blades of grass, and certainly YouTube compression isn't doing it any favors. Ultra is mostly successful, however, in preserving image quality. The strangest and most dramatic change is in the shadows. The Riftbreaker is the only game we selected for comparison that supports ray-traced effects, with RT soft shadows and ambient occlusion, both of which we maxed out. As FSR drops down from ultra quality to performance, each tier removes more of those shadows, making them lighter and less well-defined. Terminator, a game that presumably exists and which has a thriving player base of about 26 players yesterday, is one of the strongest examples of FSR that we've seen. Other than the fact that us running it on 2 computers increased its active player count by 8%, the game is interesting for other reasons. The beginning of the game takes place at night in the ruins of Pasadena, California. We could hardly tell a difference between the post-apocalyptic hellscape and Terminator Resistance. The dark concrete textures aren't incredibly sharp and detailed to begin with, so even performance mode looks good in this first screenshot, with the most obvious giveaways being the usual ones. A chain link fence, for example, in the center of the frame, and the wooden fence behind it. Dropping the render resolution to 50% reveals that parts of the chain link fence are aliased out at lower resolutions, which explains why FSR has some difficulty reconstructing it. Looking at just this scene, it'd be difficult to detect the differences between native and FSR quality, and balanced would be an acceptable compromise for a higher frame rate. We selected a second scene in Terminator with an NPC clearly visible so that we could see how FSR handled the fabric and skin. It held up just as well as it did in the previous scene, if not better. Balanced erases some detail around the NPC's collarbone, but all the detail in his face is still clearly visible. Again, the fact that Terminator's textures aren't especially high-res to begin with helps it here, but that's still a valid result. Detail in wood paneling and beams in the background is also surprisingly well preserved. There's a lot that we can benchmark with AMD's FSR, and we've only just gotten it recently, so we'll be doing more follow-up pieces in the future. We're keeping it simple for our initial round. We were most interested in image quality, which we already talked about, and our secondary interest was in overhead cost and scaling between the settings types to better understand the performance benefit or the cost from each option. We'll likely expand testing in the future, but for now we start with something that we don't think any or many of the other videos will look at for today, and that's the new AMD Ryzen 7 5700G APU that we reviewed recently and that technically isn't out for the DIY market. AMD FSR could feasibly allow these types of parts to better serve as a stopgap in between DGPU purchases. With our limited time for this one, this made the most sense to provide a unique angle and a look at the truly low end, below what you would get with a GTX 1060 or RX 580 that AMD's already sort of showcased in its keynote. We'll start with Riftbreaker. In Riftbreaker at 1080p and with the mix of medium, high, and low custom settings that we applied, we measured 46 FPS average on the 5700G when run without FSR. Moving to ultra quality, or a change to 1477 by 831, the 5700G then improved by 28%. The improvement with quality mode, or 1280 by 720, was 50% over the original stock result, or an additional 18% over the previous ultra quality mode in exchange for 300,000 fewer pixels in the source material. Balanced mode boosted to 79 FPS average, with performance jaunting to 91 FPS average. But AMD doesn't generally recommend performance mode to begin with. And with these settings and the image quality, we don't either. At 1080p, performance ends up working off of just 960 by 540 pixels, or 518,400 pixels for the source information, as opposed to over 2 million for native 1080p. Lows scaled proportionally with all the results. We didn't notice any odd behavior with frame time pacing from AMD FSR, so on the side of frame time consistency, things look good. For simplicity, we also made this quick percentage scaling chart. The blue line shows the percentage performance improvement versus baseline. The red line shows the percentage decrease in pixels from baseline. Going from FSR off to ultra quality had the largest single increment in performance uplift, at 30%, tied with going from balanced to performance. At the same time, going from FSR off to ultra quality resulted in the biggest single reduction in pixel count by percentage falloff. We dropped 41% of our pixels in the source material, but gained 30% in performance. It's clearly not perfectly linear. Things do smooth out though. With quality settings, we gained 50% over baseline FPS and dropped 55.6% of our baseline pixel data. Balanced is also fairly even, but the performance line gain crosses back over again, where we see performance mode rendering 1/4 of the pixels in exchange for double the performance when tested with these settings. That's not the 2.4x number AMD cited, but that number may have been based on something else, 4K instead, for example. Anno 1800 at 1080p low with the R7 5700G had baseline at 74 FPS average with 4-tap AA. We ran with anti-aliasing on for this one, despite initial tests with it off, because AMD's FSR kept defaulting it to 4x. You can force it off if desired, but it's the recommended setting, and after looking at it, there's a good reason for that. That result improved to 90 FPS average, then 102 in the bar chart, then 116, then 132 FPS with performance mode. We needed another one of the percent scaling charts to help out though. Anno 1800, again, shown here, follows the same rules as the Riftbreaker chart. The highest cost of source material is experienced at the offset with ultra quality, but we only gained 21% more performance versus baseline with this configuration. From there, things scaled mostly linearly and at a steep curve, getting steeper when moving from balanced to performance mode. Performance mode is a waste here. You aren't going to need super high frame rates in Anno to begin with, but even if you did, dropping 75% of the source material, which is what's used to reconstruct the image, for a 79% uplift just isn't a good trade. Because frame rate isn't that important in Anno, we also ran at 1080p medium settings on the R7 5700G, and then we checked just the quality mode against baseline off. This change got us up to 65 FPS average, similar in scaling to the lower settings, and that moved from 42 FPS to a more playable result. Lows improved in step, moving to 33 for 0.1% lows. For the 5700G, this is the more realistic scenario. With FSR, we've been able to enable higher quality settings, going again up to medium instead of low for everything, at the exchange of resolution. But we get the improvement with FSR, and so the end result is a more playable frame rate with a better image quality. Next, a quick look at overhead. Testing at 720p native versus 1080p at quality should give us a like-for-like resolution comparison, but super resolution in this comparison creates a better quality image. That, of course, has a cost. We can only speak for lower-end hardware in this quick test, but the 5700G ended up with a 15% overhead, shown here between these two benchmarks, with the end result being a better quality image, of course. So that's it for this one then. Overall, FSR appears to be it's in an interesting position because when DLSS came out the first time, we had a lot of problems with it. And the main problems were pretty simple. One was image quality was not good. It was very blurry. It was like Vaseline all over the screen. It just didn't work very well. And the second problem, it was locked to hardware. And the third problem, it wasn't even really using the hardware that it was locked to. It was an effort to sell more RTX cards when RTX was a new initialism. It didn't exist before that, it was GTX. And so as NVIDIA tried to build hype and marketing and interest around RTX and this whole new software suite and paradigm shift in the company's marketing, it locked down DLSS to RT devices. But it wasn't always really using the RT hardware. That was kind of the tricky thing about it. So it was a bit misleading. DLSS 2.0 came out, and actually, in the games where it works, like Control, for example, is extremely good. It does a great job at conquering a lot of the same challenges that FSR tries to conquer, except in a way which is just objectively more advanced and, you could say, using computer terminology that marketers like to use, smart or intelligent. But that doesn't mean that FSR is bad. It just means that NVIDIA is doing something in a much more complicated way. So as long as FSR can avoid certain things like really bad blurring and the Vaseline effect, then it's in a good spot. And thus far, the biggest downside to FSR is clearly the games list. But it has a lot of upsides. And the number one upside is that it's not hardware locked. It does work with older GPUs from both vendors. It's only been validated officially by AMD back to GTX 1060 and RX 480 or 470 era for AMD's devices. But you can run FSR on older stuff than that. We haven't tested too far back to see at what point it just doesn't work, but at least the GTX 9 series should work, and older than RX 400 series should work as well. So that's cool, and that's a really good place to be. You do still lose quality with this. That's always going to be the case. So AMD was really stretching the truth when it said in the reviewer's guide that sometimes the image quality is better than native. But AMD, in that sentence, you can read the guilt in the marketing BS from whoever wrote that, because there's just one qualifier after another of when it might be considered better than native. And ultimately, it can't really be better than native with this approach. You might perceive it that way subjectively, just based on whatever specific game, specific device, specific settings, maybe you'll perceive it that way, especially if you like sharper images. But that is getting pretty far into the subjective at this point. So just to be really clear, there is going to be data loss when you are rendering at a lower count of pixels and then bringing it up to something else. It's not something to be really ashamed of unless it's terrible. And in the instances of high quality and quality, AMD does pretty well to hold on to a lot of that detail. You start losing the small shadow details, the 1 pixel wide details go away if they're not rendered at the lower resolution clearly, because you need something there in order to bring the data up into a higher resolution. But ultimately, it's a good first start, but it's very weak in the games department. I mean, Terminator, 26 players yesterday. And I'm pretty confident that most of them are people I know who are also reviewers. I don't think there are that many real players. Sorry if you were one of them, but hey, you were online at the same time as a bunch of reviewers at least. Other than that, Anno seems like maybe the most legitimate or the largest of them. Riftbreaker looks like it has a little bit of interest around it. So they're getting out there, but AMD really needs to get into stuff like Cyberpunk. CAS is in Cyberpunk, and yet FSR is conveniently absent from it. Why is that? DLSS. So AMD is trying very hard right now to avoid DLSS comparisons, and that's the part we really want to see is as it starts spreading, when will AMD become comfortable enough or confident enough in its product that it is willing to put it into a game that DLSS is also, and that's the comparison we want to see, even if they're not directly linearly the same. They're sort of trying to tackle some of the same issues, though, and that's why it's interesting. Anyway, good first start, needs more games, and until it gets them, we can't really say much more about it, but from a technology standpoint, it appears to be working more or less as it should be. Just performance mode looks bad. Probably don't use that one. But high quality is not bad. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly in these endeavors. And we'll see you all next time.